I'm going to produce this video in kind of two parts. The first part is addressing a poll that was done on, or survey perhaps is a better word, that was done on attitudes towards the supposed peace negotiations in Ukraine. And I'm just reading out directly from Meanwhile in Ukraine. It is a pro-Ukraine group, but this is what they've published on their platform. Most Americans say forcing Ukraine to give up land is unacceptable. New poll. A new, more uncommon. That's the polling group. Snap poll shows that a slim majority of Americans, 51%, reject any peace deal that forces Ukraine to surrender territory or limit its army. Conditions recently floated in a leaked proposal. In other words, most Americans see this for what it is: a victory for Putin, not peace. The survey also found strong resistance to these ideas across Europe, including the UK, France, Germany and Poland. For many, the message is simple: you don't end a war by rewarding the aggressor. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is one of the defining events of this era, and there's a lot of things to say about it. I could have addressed, for example, the Putin-Modi meeting recently. India claims that it is not neutral because it's pro-peace, but the truth is India is still a very strong trading partner of Russia. I do think it's a failure of the world's biggest democracy, that is the world's most populous democracy, not to be more vocal in condemning Russian aggression. You cannot be neutral when it comes to aggression. I just think that's an untenable position. If Modi and the Indian government don't want to be seen as they might see it to be just towing the line with the West, they should at least consider what's happened to Indian citizens in Russia, in some cases reportedly forcibly drafted into the Russian armed forces. What I want to address, so that's the first thing. It's a tiny majority of Americans, but 51% is hardly anything to get excited about. Unfortunately, a lot of Americans, I think, are still under this notion that it's it's just a Slavic war between two countries that are always at each other's throats. I think that's how many Americans see it. I'm not talking about those courageous Americans who have went to Ukraine as volunteers and in some cases laid down their lives. I'm not talking about enlightened Americans who can see Putin for what he is. I'm not talking about traditional Republicans who would be sick at the idea of an American president pandering to a Russian dictator. Utterly the opposite of Reaganism. It's almost hard to comprehend. In Europe, that's not surprising either. The fact that most Europeans are deeply sceptical of these peace negotiations that clearly favour Russia. I personally think it's a callous betrayal of Ukraine. I think that Trump has shown his lack of statesmanship with it. There is a school of thought that says, why don't the Ukrainians just take peace at any cost? But the problem is it's not true peace. And importantly, it would also give Russia a green light for a potential third invasion. I just think it's not a case of the Ukraine. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, but at the price of selling their country, at the price of allowing a big segment of the population to be basically slaves of the Russian Federation, it's grotesque. It's a grotesque proposition. I'm reassured that most Europeans do see it for what it is. However, I'm under no illusions that there are a lot of useful idiots out there for Putin, including in this country. If you see any report about Russia and Ukraine, there will be a few people coming out of the woodwork, coming out with pro-Kremlin narratives. And these are not Russian nationals, these are Westerners. And I don't know, I don't think it would be a case that they're all actually paid spies. I think that's unrealistic, because the whole point of espionage is you're in the shadows, right? But I do think that there is a lot of very, very ignorant people out there who are being fed disinformation. we can look at the 2020s as having two major viruses, COVID and disinformation. And a lot of that disinformation comes from Moscow and Beijing, but I would say particularly Moscow, and also powerful individuals like Elon Musk. It's a very, very, very dangerous thing in my opinion. So the other part of this video, I want to talk a bit about that disinformation, because there's a case I've looked at online which I think exemplifies this, and it's a case of a Chilean American reporter, or so-called reporter. I think we can treat that with some degree of caution, but his name was Gonzalo Lira, and basically he died in Ukrainian custody in January last year, January 2024, at the age of 55. And I'll put a link to the Wikipedia article, but the reason I'm mentioning this is it came up on my timeline. How shocking. The Biden administration and Zelensky covered this up, and how awful that an American citizen died in Ukrainian custody and the American government done nothing about it. And if you look at it that way, if you just look at this at surface level, you think, that is pretty shady, it's awful. But then you look a little bit more and you actually consider the context. I'm going to read out a bit from the Wikipedia article, but also I want to highlight the context of this, because that is extremely important. Now, before I do this, I want to make a kind of disclaimer. Yes, I'm absolutely on the side of Ukraine. Yes, I see the Russian invasion for what it is. But I don't say that Ukraine is perfect. I don't say that Ukraine's human rights record is perfect. So it is important that Ukraine is transparent to reassure allies. That's true. Ukraine right now is going through a corruption scandal, which might embarrass President Zelensky. But again, the fact that Ukraine has corruption doesn't somehow vindicate Russia. It doesn't somehow, wipe the slate clean for Russia's many, many war crimes and Russian barbarism in Ukraine. America has corruption. This idea that because Ukraine is not perfect, that somehow vindicates the killer in the Kremlin is obscene. I've never said Ukraine is perfect. And if you ask most Ukrainians, they would acknowledge that. I'm closely linked to the Ukrainian community here, and you will find that some of the most diverse opinions on Ukraine itself, i.e. Ukrainian society, is from Ukrainians. In fact, if you look at publications like the Kyiv Post, it's hardly, sycophantic to Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. They're often critical of the Ukrainian government. They will openly report issues within Ukrainian politics. Contrast that to the likes of RT, which is absolutely a mouthpiece for Putin. There's just no comparison. So I'm going to read out a bit of this case. Like I say, this guy Gonzalo Lira was described as a journalist, but I think he's more better described as a propagandist. By the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, Lira had been living in Ukraine for years, and as a resident of Kharkiv, Lira started vlogging about the Russian invasion, soon being described by Ukrainian officials and Western researchers and media as spreading Russian disinformation and propaganda. In April 2022, Lira disappeared briefly in Ukraine, stating upon his release he had been detained by the Security Service of Ukraine. In May 2023, Lira was again arrested by the SBU, and this time charged with producing and publishing material that tried to justify the ongoing Russian invasion, something illegal under Ukrainian law. Lira was released on bail and subsequently tried to flee the country. He was arrested again for violating his bail conditions and died of pneumonia in custody on January 12, 2024. Now, the circumstances of his death do need to be investigated. If that hasn't already happened, there has to be transparency on that. But people die in custody more often than people think. It happens in British prisons, it happens in American prisons. Dying in custody isn't necessarily a sign of torture or abuse. But like I say, the Ukrainians are not perfect. There may well have been something nefarious there. Having said that, Oh, by the way, that it's worth looking a little bit at his background. This guy was an American citizen of Chilean descent. He was known for, at one point, he was called the highest paid Chilean writer in the world. He was known for his involvement in the manosphere, posting anti-feminist content under the name Coach Red Pill, and in the political sphere, he was conservative. He was known for promoting Pinochetism, that is, he was a proponent of Augusto Pinochet's politics. So pretty hard right, we can say. And he was a Russophile, you know. He was very clearly promoting pro-Kremlin material. Now, let's just step back a little bit and look at this. We have an American citizen living in Ukraine. I understand he had a Ukrainian wife, but then was separated. An American citizen living in Ukraine promoting pro-Russia propaganda, which included the denial of atrocities like Bucha. Think about that for a second. This is very, very important because that context is significant. Imagine if the United States was invaded and American citizens were slaughtered in atrocities by the invader. And then you had a foreign national living in the United States and they were saying it's all America's fault and the invader is correct and those atrocities haven't happened. That's the context. So I struggle to have much sympathy with this guy, quite frankly. The fact that he was arrested is because he was breaking Ukrainian law. You know, you can't go to another country and just break the law. And the sheer hypocrisy of those who would kind of hold this guy up as a poster boy of how awful the Ukrainians are, you know, in order to promote the Kremlin narrative. It's missing that context. This was an American national living in Ukraine promoting the propaganda of Ukraine's enemy at a time when Ukraine was under occupation, or parts of Ukraine were under occupation, when Ukrainian civilians were slaughtered. I mean, that is a damn insult to the Ukrainian people. This idea that he's a victim is obscene. I think the Ukrainians done right to arrest the guy. I mean, he's working for their enemy. What other way can you look at it? And you know, you look at some of the people who were promoting Lira. Just scroll down a bit here. I'll read a bit more about the case actually. Here we go. On April the 15th, 2022, friends and family of Lira said they had lost touch with him, after which Chile's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so I guess he had dual citizenship, began searching for his whereabouts. American spokesperson for Ukraine's Territorial Defense Forces, Sarah Ashton Cirillo, reported Lira's apparent capture by Ukrainian forces on April the 18th. Lira became the subject of conspiracy theories surrounding his alleged murder. However, he was resurfaced again on April the 22nd, 2022, stating he had been detained by the SBU for the period he was missing. On May the 1st, 2023, Lira was arrested for violating Article 4362-2 of Ukraine's Criminal Code, which prohibits justification of Russia's ongoing invasion of the country. Seems pretty reasonable to me. The Ukrainian Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security said Lira had also shared pro-Russian disinformation, such as claiming the Bucha massacre was faked, or that the Ukrainian government was a neo-Nazi regime, and that Lira had shared video of himself insulting Ukrainian soldiers. His arrest was reported by the SBU on May the 5th. Lira was subsequently released on bail and placed under house arrest. He returned to social media stating he had been tortured while imprisoned, an allegation denied by the SBU. Lira attempted to flee the country by crossing the Hungarian border on July the 31st to claim political asylum, but was captured and arrested again for violating his bail conditions. In December 2023, Elon Musk, CEO of X, publicly inquired about Lira on his platform in response to a post by media personality Tucker Carlson calling Lira a political prisoner. Well, as we know, Tucker Carlson's a totally neutral source. Go figure. The SBU responded that Lira had been detained in accordance with the law. Musk's post was also labelled with a community note explaining the nature of Lira's charges, after which Musk said the note had been gamed by state actors. In a Business Insider interview that month, American spokesperson for Ukraine's Territorial Defense Services, Sarah Ashton Cirillo, asserted that Lira had fabricated his torture accusations in an effort to gain sympathy, and also no doubt to, blacken Ukraine's reputation. The torture allegations, I'm not going to say 100% it's false. I don't know that as an absolute fact. I will say this though, when the invasion happened and Russian soldiers were captured, for the most part, the Ukrainians treated them well. They gave them water, they let young soldiers call back to their families. Contrast that to the barbaric way that Russia treats Ukrainian prisoners. Contrast it to the way that the former mayor of Kherson, was detained. He came out almost like a skeleton, really emaciated. There are so many cases documenting, clear evidence of how Russia treats prisoners of war. Think about this for a second. This guy Lira, a Russia propagandist in Ukraine, insulting Ukrainian victims of Russian barbarism. I mean, what the hell do his supporters expect? I challenge them. If the United States was invaded and you had a foreign national promoting the enemy's narrative, would the American government be okay with that? Give me a break. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the people, trying to portray Lira as an innocent victim of the Ukrainians would have no problem with what Trump's doing regarding the ICE raids. Why is that significant? It's significant because of the double standards. They seem to think that, Americans should have special rights. This guy was a propagandist for Ukraine's oppressor, frankly. And yes, the circumstances of his death do need to be made clear, but, when you consider the crimes that Russia has committed, I just think it's sickening that you get people out there like Lira, and there's others, who knowingly spread lies about it and then try to present themselves as independent journalists. They're not. They're lapdogs of the Kremlin. In fact, if the Biden administration didn't help this guy, it's probably because he was a traitor. He was working for a hostile foreign government, essentially. So that's not journalism. Promoting the propaganda of the Kremlin when you're an American citizen, or I would argue a British or German or French citizen, it's treason, really. Treasonous, at least. If not treason by law, it's certainly treasonous by ideology. But this case, I think, highlights a much wider problem, which is that most decent people see the Russian aggression for what it is, but there is a minority of useful idiots out there. And the problem is they're very confident and they're very vocal, and they put this poison online. I mean, this guy Lira, a proponent of Augusto Pinochet, that's not someone who believes in human rights. That's not someone who believes in holding accountability of power. So I just think that we need to be very, very aware of the fact that this is a propaganda war as much as anything, and that Putin is relying on Western puppets. Putin is relying on, I could say useful idiots, but the problem is I don't think all of them are actually stupid. I think some of them know full well what they're doing. But I would say that someone who defends a brutal dictatorship, denies atrocities against women and children, tries to justify a regime that kidnaps children, a regime that tortures prisoners of war, a regime that does all the things it's done in Ukraine, someone like that, as far as I'm concerned, is morally bankrupt. I actually think they're the lowest of the low, quite frankly. Now, in the UK context, Nathan Gill is now serving a lengthy sentence for treason. I highly doubt that he is the only one. That's why I do not trust that reform, they welcomed the verdict when it was announced as if they had nothing to do with it. What are the chances that the Kremlin only recruited one person in reform? I think that's unlikely. One middle-ranking, personnel, I just think it's unlikely. We're not talking here about low-level councillor. We're talking about a relatively senior person, and yet not the very top. So that suggests to me that the Kremlin's looking at who could be a possible asset. Farage might be too high profile himself, so it may not necessarily be Farage, but there could be people around him. I hope reform continues to get under the microscope. All this racist stuff that's being levelled against Farage is one thing, but it's also the Russia ties. And I just hope that they continue to be under massive scrutiny. I hope to God that reform does not get into power, because I think if they do, they will sell this country to Trumpism, and they'll frankly be a national security threat, given their ties to Russia. It's deeply alarming. As for a scumbag like Tucker Carlson, I mean, that's putting it politely, quite frankly. The man is an absolute shameless propagandist for the Kremlin. If you look at the track record of these people, to claim that they're somehow investigative journalists is an insult to the principle of journalism. An investigative journalist doesn't allow themselves to be a propagandist for any government. And again, I draw the contrast with something like the Kyiv Post. Their journalists question the Ukrainian government. That's what good journalists do. So it's not a case that they're just a mouthpiece for Zelensky. They question the Ukrainian government as well. That's the contrast. But someone like Gonzalo Lira, he's not an innocent victim. He's not some poor, investigative journalist who is just punished by a despotic regime. This is a guy who is promoting the propaganda of an invading force in a country that had been invaded. Think about that. And the absurdity for American Putin sycophants to treat him like he's some sort of, the real victims are the Ukrainian people. And that's the reality of the situation. Just going to check if there's anything else I want to follow up on. There's also been, excuse me, I was talking about Kyiv Post, also the Kyiv Independent. But the other thing, of course, is that Don Sturgis, the British citizen who died after the Salisbury poisoning, it's basically been ruled that Putin has blood on his hands over that. I mean, that's stating the obvious. But quite frankly, I expect Russian nationalists to be what they are, to be very vocally defensive of Putinism. What I think is unforgivable, and disgusting is Westerners who support Putin. I mean, for Americans who do it, I think they tend to be quite ignorant, and they are a long way from Ukraine. But for Britons who do it, or Dutch nationals, Germans, they are beneath contempt, because they are supporting a tyranny that clearly threatens this continent. Putin is unquestionably the biggest threat to Europe since Hitler, and as we saw with Salisbury, a direct threat to this country. I just have no words. When I think of my Ukrainian friends, when I think of the little children that are in that community, that there are people out there who would actually try and justify what Russia does, I think they're disgusting. I think they're despicable, morally bankrupt, contemptible. I can't use enough adjectives to describe what I think of those people. And I hope Nathan Gill isn't the last traitor to face justice, because I'm pretty sure he won't be the only one. And the more who are exposed and brought to justice, the more, hopefully it will be a deterrent.